The morning Josephine Leland rode into the valley of the Cimarron Basin. The air still smelled of gunpowder, and the bodies of 3 dead cattle lay bloating in the July heat of 1882, and she did not flinch once. She had ridden 53 miles from the burned husk of her husband's ranch outside of Dodge City, and she had not slept in 2 days. Her black mourning dress was caked with red dust from the Oklahoma Territory Trail. Her dark hair had come half loose from its pins, and she was leading a second horse that carried everything she owned in 2 canvas saddlebags and a leather trunk strapped across the animal's haunches. She was 28 years old. She had buried her husband 4 months prior, and she had absolutely nowhere else to go. The ranch that had once been hers and William's had been swallowed by debt and drought and one terrible winter, and all that remained of that life was a folded deed to a parcel of land in the Cimarron Basin that William had purchased sight unseen before his fever took him in March. She had the deed in her coat pocket. She had $43. She had a Winchester rifle across her saddle and a Colt revolver on her hip that she knew how to use, because William had insisted she learn, and she had always been a quick study. She crested the last ridge above the basin, and that was when she heard the shooting. It was not close shooting, not at first. It was the distant percussion of rifles echoing off the canyon walls to the north and south, a measured, ugly back and forth that told her this was not the first morning these guns had spoken to each other. Below her in the basin, she could see a wide stretch of open grass land bisected by a creek that ran brown and low in the summer heat. On the eastern side of the creek, she could make out the shapes of men crouched behind a low stone wall and a stand of cottonwoods. On the western side, more men were positioned along a ridge line with their rifles raised. Between these 2 groups, there was perhaps 400 yards of open ground that nothing living was crossing. Josephine sat her horse on the ridge for a long moment and studied the scene below with the flat, calculating gaze of a woman who had survived enough to stop being surprised by the ugliness of men. Then she clicked her horse forward and began riding straight down into the valley. She did not take the long way around. She did not circle behind either side. She rode directly down the center of the open ground between the 2 opposing positions, at a steady walk, her spine straight as a fence post, her chin level, her hands visible on the reins. The shooting stopped. It stopped the way sound stops when you press your hands over your ears, suddenly and completely, and the silence that rushed in was so absolute that she could hear her horse's hooves in the dry grass, one after another, steady and unhurried. She rode until she reached the creek, let her horse drink, then turned and looked in both directions at the men staring at her from their positions. She could feel their confusion from where she sat. She could feel their uncertainty, which was the most dangerous thing about armed men, and yet she sat perfectly still on her horse and waited. On the eastern side of the creek, behind the stone wall, a man in a brown canvas coat slowly straightened up from his crouch and stared. His name was Harlan Vaughn, and he had been crouched behind that wall for the better part of 2 hours with a rifle he had not fired yet, because he was the foreman of the Bellamy Ranch and Chester Bellamy had given him very specific orders, which were to hold the position and not let the Stroud riders cross the creek. He had not been given orders about what to do when a lone woman in a black mourning dress rode down out of the ridge as though she were simply on an afternoon's journey and hadn't the faintest concern for the bullets that had been exchanging themselves across this particular piece of ground all morning. He stood fully upright now, his rifle lowered. Beside him, a young cowhand named Duff whispered, "Who is she?" Harlan did not answer because he did not know. On the western ridge, the same question was forming in the throats of the Stroud riders. Ren Stroud himself, a broad-shouldered man of 50 with a silver-shot beard and a face the color of weathered saddle leather, pushed his hat back on his head and squinted down at the woman sitting her horse in the middle of the creek. "Who in the hell is that?" he said. Nobody answered him either. Josephine Leland let the silence hold for another moment, then she guided her horse out of the creek onto the eastern bank, not the western bank. the eastern bank, where the stone wall was, where the Bellamy riders were, because the land deed in her pocket bore the name of a property bordered on the south by the Bellamy Ranch's northern fence line, and she had studied her maps very carefully. She walked her horse up to the stone wall and stopped. Harlan Vaughn was the closest man to her, and he was looking up at her with the most complicated expression she thought she had ever seen on a human face. He was somewhere in his mid-30s. She estimated, lean in the way that men who work outdoors are lean, with dark eyes under the shadow of a battered hat brim and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. There was something careful about him, she noticed, something watchful. He wasn't the kind of man who moved quickly toward decisions, and she respected that. "Morning," she said. He blinked. "Morning," he said after a moment. "I'm looking for Chester Bellamy," she said. "I have some business to discuss with him." Harlan glanced once toward the western ridge, where the Stroud riders had not yet moved, then looked back at her. "This isn't a particularly good time for a visit," he said, his voice measured, like he was choosing each word the way you choose which plank to step on crossing a rotted floor. "I can see that," she said. "But I've been 2 days in the saddle and I have a property deed that concerns his fence line, and I'd rather settle it peaceable if I can." She paused. "The shooting stopped when I came through. Might as well make use of that." He studied her for another moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone except, it seemed, Josephine herself. Then Harlan Vaughn turned to the young cowhand named Duff and said quietly, "Ride back to the ranch house and tell Mr. Bellamy we have a visitor." He turned back to her. "You're welcome to wait at the house. I'll have someone ride you in." "I can find my own way if you tell me the direction," she said. "I don't doubt that," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "But I'll ride with you myself if that's agreeable. The Stroud riders might have questions about why you came to our side of the creek." "Let them have questions," she said. "Questions are better than bullets." He almost smiled at that. It came and went so quickly she wasn't entirely sure she'd seen it, but she thought she had. He handed his rifle to another rider, swung up onto a bay horse that had been standing ground-tied behind the wall, and fell in beside her as she turned east toward the distant cluster of buildings that made up the Bellamy Ranch headquarters. They rode for a while without speaking, which was the kind of silence that happens between two people who are each privately sizing up the other and finding the process more interesting than they'd expected. "I'm Harlan Vaughn," he said at last. "Foreman here." "Josephine Leland," she said. "Where'd you ride from, Mrs. Leland?" "Outside Dodge City. And it's just Josephine, or Miss Leland if you need something more formal." She paused. "My husband passed in March." "I'm sorry," he said, and said it the way a man says it who means it, not the way men sometimes say it out of social habit. "Thank you," she said. They rode in silence a little longer. The basin spread wide and gold-green around them in the morning light, and despite everything that had brought her here, Josephine felt something small and quiet inside her acknowledge that it was beautiful country. Rough and dry and enormous in the way that only the Oklahoma Territory could be, but beautiful. "What's the fight about?" she asked. "The range war." He glanced at her, then back at the trail. "Water," he said. "Water and grass and fence lines. The usual." "The usual," she repeated. "Stroud has been pushing his cattle north across the creek for 3 summers now, eating grass that belongs to Bellamy Gray's rights and fouling the water. Chester Bellamy isn't the kind of man who lets things go on unanswered." He paused. "Neither is Ren Stroud. Anyone killed? 2 men so far, 1 on each side. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then it's been mostly noise." He paused again. "Until this morning." "What happened this morning?" "Stroud cut a section of fence and pushed 400 head across overnight. Bellamy's riders found them at dawn." He kept his eyes forward. "It was going to get worse today. I could feel it." She considered that. "And then I rode down the ridge." "And then you rode down the ridge," he said, "in a black dress on a dark horse right down the middle of the shooting ground." He looked at her sideways. "You weren't afraid?" "I was," she said simply. "But I've found that fear and action can occupy the same moment if you let them." He looked at her longer this time, and she felt it, felt the weight of that attention, and it was different from the way men had looked at her since William died, which was either with condescension or with the calculating appraisal of men who thought a widow was an opportunity. This felt more like the way you look at something you haven't seen before and aren't quite sure how to categorize. The Bellamy Ranch house was a long, low structure of adobe and timber that spoke of a man who had been in this country long enough to understand it. There were cottonwoods planted around it that had been there 20 years at least, and a bunkhouse to the east, and a large barn south of the main house, and a cook's fire going outside the kitchen door. It looked like a working ranch that took itself seriously. Chester Bellamy was on the porch when they rode in. He was 60 years old and built like a man who had spent those 60 years in physical argument with the landscape, broad across the shoulders with white hair and a white mustache, and the kind of blue eyes that had gone bright and hard from too much sun. He watched Josephine dismount with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and reserve. Duff had ridden fast and told him something, but whatever Duff had told him, it had clearly not prepared him for her. "Mr. Bellamy," Josephine said, pulling the deed from her coat pocket as she stepped up to the porch. "My name is Josephine Leland. My late husband purchased a parcel in this basin 18 months ago. I believe it sits along your northern fence line, and I've come to settle in it." She held out the deed. "I'd like to know if there's anything about the current situation that might complicate that." Chester Bellamy took the deed and read it slowly with the deliberate manner of a man who does not let himself be hurried. When he was done, he looked up at her. "This is Old Cutter's Flat," he said, 40 acres on the north end of the basin." "Yes, sir," she said. "There's a cabin on it, been empty 3 years. I know, I'd like to fix it up." He studied her the way Harlan had studied her, but with different eyes. Chester Bellamy's eyes were the eyes of a man calculating risk and benefit, not whatever Harlan's eyes had been doing. "Where's your husband?" "Buried in Dodge City." He looked at the deed again, then at her, then past her at Harlan, who had come up quietly behind her. Chester and Harlan exchanged a look that had the compressed language of two men who knew each other well. "You understand what's happening in this basin right now," Chester said. "I rode through the middle of it this morning," Josephine said. "So yes." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Come inside," he said. "I'll have coffee made." The kitchen was large and practical and smelled of wood smoke and cured meat and coffee. An older woman named Rose, who ran the Bellamy household, brought cups and poured without being asked, and disappeared with the tactful efficiency of someone who knew when their presence was not needed. Chester sat across from Josephine at the long table and spread the deed flat between them. Harlan stood near the door in that way he seemed to have, present and attentive but not inserting himself into what wasn't his. "Stroud doesn't know this parcel changed hands," Chester said. "He's been eyeing Cutter's Flat for 2 years, wanted to buy it for the water rights on the north end." "It's not for sale," Josephine said. Chester looked at her with something that shaded toward respect. "Mrs. Leland, Ren Stroud is not a gentle man when he wants something." "I'm familiar with men who aren't gentle when they want something," she said. "I've dealt with them before." There was a brief silence. "I'll say this plainly," Chester continued. "Cutter's Flat sits north of my fence but south of where Stroud wants to push. If you settle there, you become part of this dispute whether you like it or not." "The dispute was already there," she said. "The question is whether the land is mine or not, and according to that deed and the Territorial Land Office records, it is." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came here because this land is all I have left, and I intend to build something on it." Chester Bellamy looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once slowly, with the gravity of a man making a decision he knows he'll have to stand behind. "All right," he said. "Harlan will ride you up to the flat this afternoon. Take stock of what needs doing." He paused. "And Mrs. Leland, you come to us if there's trouble. Stroud's men have been riding rough over anyone they think won't push back." "I push back," she said quietly. She saw Harlan shift slightly near the door at that, and she did not look at him, but she was aware of it. Cutter's Flat was everything the name suggested. A wide, level stretch of short grass land with a small creek running north to south along its eastern edge, and a stand of cottonwoods and willows around the water. The cabin was low and made of sod and timber and badly wanted repair. 2 of the 4 windows had lost their oilskin coverings, and the door hung crooked on its leather hinges, and there were mice and the evidence of mice everywhere inside, but the walls were solid and the roof had held and the stone fireplace was intact. Josephine stood in the middle of the single main room and turned slowly, assessing. Harlan stood in the doorway behind her, letting her look without commentary. "It's fixable," she said. "It is," he agreed. "The creek is good. Runs year-round. Better than most in the basin." He paused. "William built this, paid for the parcel and the right to build. He died before he could." She ran her hand along the fireplace mantel, which was a single piece of timber, rough-hewn but solid. He had a picture of this valley in his mind for years. Used to talk about it. She was quiet for a moment. "He was a good man." "How long were you married?" 6 years. She turned from the fireplace. "Long enough to know what I had, short enough that it still hurts." He nodded at that with a kind of simple acknowledgement that she appreciated. He did not say something useless like "time heals" or "he's in a better place," which was what most people said and which never helped anything. He simply acknowledged that it was true and let it be true without trying to fix it. "I'll help you get the door rehung today," he said. "And there's oilskin at the ranch house we can spare for the windows. Gets cold at night even in July out here." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't," he said, and left it at that. They worked through the afternoon, Josephine cleaning out the interior with a broom she fashioned from cottonwood branches and dry grass, while Harlan reset the door and its hinges and cut new oilskin for the window frames. He was good with his hands in the quiet way of men who had always worked with them, efficient and careful, and without any of the showiness that some men brought to physical labor when a woman was watching. Rose had sent provisions with them, dried beans and salt pork, and a sack of cornmeal and a tin of coffee, enough for a week if she was careful, and Josephine organized these on the single shelf above the fireplace with the methodical calm of a woman who had reorganized her life more than once and knew how to begin from what was available. By the time the sun was dropping behind the western ridge, the cabin was inhabitable if not comfortable, and Josephine had a fire going in the stone hearth and coffee ready. She poured 2 cups and handed one to Harlan, who had settled onto the porch step, and she sat in the single chair she dragged outside, and they looked at the basin in the evening light. The light in this country at evening was something she hadn't prepared for. It came in long and amber from the west and turned everything it touched the color of old gold, the grass and the canyon walls and the surface of the creek, and it was so purely beautiful that for a moment she forgot everything that had brought her here and simply let it happen to her. "I see why he wanted this land," she said softly. Harlan looked at her profile in that sideways way he had. "It's good country," he said. "Hard but good, the kind of country that gives back what you put in." "Is that why you stayed?" she asked. "With Bellamy," he turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I came up from Texas with Chester's first cattle drive 10 years ago, was going to push on north eventually, never did." He looked out at the valley. "The land took hold of me, I suppose. And there's no one waiting somewhere else for you?" She asked and immediately felt that she had been too direct, which she tended to be when she was tired, but she didn't take it back. He looked at her. "No," he said simply. "You." "Just this," she said, meaning the land, meaning the cabin, meaning the deed in her pocket and the plan she was building out of what remained. The silence that followed was a comfortable one, the kind that happens between 2 people who have worked alongside each other for a day and found each other's company more natural than they'd expected. When Harlan finally rose to go, he turned at the edge of the porch and said, "The Bellamy hands ride this line every morning. If you need anything, put a piece of red cloth on that cottonwood by the gate and someone will come." "I'll remember that," she said. He swung up onto his horse and then looked down at her from the saddle with those dark, careful eyes. "You did something remarkable this morning," he said, "riding down that ridge the way you did." She looked up at him. "I had nowhere else to go," she said, which was the simple truth. Something moved through his expression at that, something that wasn't pity, which she would not have accepted, but something with a different quality altogether. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse south toward the Bellamy ranch, and she watched him go until the amber light swallowed him up. She slept that night on the cot she'd found in the corner, with her rifle against the wall and the fire low in the hearth, and for the first time since William had died, she did not lie awake for hours with the weight of everything pressing down on her. She was asleep before the fire burned out. The days that followed were full of work, the kind of physical, purposeful work that she found she had been needing badly without knowing it. She replastered the interior walls where the mud had cracked and fallen away. She repaired the fence of the small corral behind the cabin. She dug and cleaned out the root cellar that had partially collapsed and restocked it with what she could preserve or buy. She planted a kitchen garden in the ground south of the cabin, knowing it was late for the season but needing to do it anyway, needing to put something in the ground. The Bellamy riders came by every morning, as Harlan had said, and sometimes it was Duff or one of the other hands, and sometimes it was Harlan himself. When it was Harlan, the morning took on a different quality. He had the habit of stopping at the fence line and asking, simply, if there was anything needed, and if she said no, he would touch his hat and ride on, and if she said yes, he would dismount and help without fanfare or the kind of elaborate, helpful behavior that announces itself. He helped her drag a fallen cottonwood limb away from the creek bank that was damming the water. He helped her reset a corner post on the corral fence. He brought her a side of salt beef from the Bellamy smokehouse with the uncomplicated statement that Chester had said to bring it. She noticed that he never invented reasons to stay longer than was useful. She also noticed that he never seemed in a hurry to leave when there was still something to do. On the 5th day, Ren Stroud came. He came in the middle of the morning with 3 riders behind him, which was too many for a polite visit and not enough for a real threat, which meant it was a demonstration, which was what she had expected. She was in the garden when she heard the horses, and she stood up slowly and wiped her hands on her work skirt and walked to the fence without hurrying. She did not reach for her rifle, which was leaning against the cabin wall 40 feet away, but she knew exactly where it was. Stroud stopped his horse at the gate and looked down at her. Up close, he was an imposing man, built for authority in the way that some men are, physically large and accustomed to having that largeness work for him. His 3 riders arranged themselves behind and to either side with the practiced geometry of men who did this sort of thing regularly. "You're the woman who rode through the shooting ground," he said. "Good morning," Josephine said, his mouth pressed together at her tone. "Who are you?" "My name is Josephine Leland. I own this parcel. Is there something I can do for you?" He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I have an offer for this land, fair market price, cash payment." "It's not for sale," she said. "You haven't looked at the amount." "It doesn't matter. I have nowhere else to go, and this land was my husband's dream before it was mine. It's not for sale." He leaned on his saddle horn and looked at her with the patient, deliberate expression of a man who is used to being the largest obstacle in any room. "Mrs. Leland, this basin has a conflict in it right now that could get very unpleasant. Cutter's Flat sits in the middle of it. I would think a woman in your situation would rather be somewhere safer." "I appreciate your concern," she said, and let the 3 words carry the full weight of her not appreciating it at all. One of the riders behind Stroud made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh and then suppressed it. Stroud's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're on the wrong side of this dispute," he said. "I'm not on any side," she said. "I'm on my own land." He studied her a moment longer. "Think it over," he said, refolding the paper and putting it back in his pocket. "The offer stands." He wheeled his horse and rode out with his men behind him, and she stood at the fence and watched until they were over the north rim of the flat. Then she let out a breath and sat down on the fence rail, and found that her hands were shaking slightly, which was fine. They were allowed to shake as long as they'd stayed steady when they needed to be. Harlan appeared at the south end of the flat less than an hour later, coming fast, and she realized one of the Bellamy riders must have seen Stroud's party and sent word. He came through the gate and pulled up and looked at her, his eyes checking her the way you check something you're worried might be broken, quickly and thoroughly. "Stroud came," he said. "He did. What did he want? To buy the land, to imply that I was vulnerable, the usual." She crossed her arms. "I declined both." He dismounted and stood looking at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that wasn't quite admiration but lived in the same county. "Chester's going to want to know. Tell him. And tell him I'm not interested in being anyone's strategic property. I'm a neighbor, not a chess piece." Harlan stood quiet for a moment, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. "You know your presence here changes things," he said. "Not badly, but it changes them." "How?" "Stroud can't push across the flat without going through a legal landowner. That complicates his plans considerably." He paused. "But it also makes you someone he wants moved." "He's going to find that I don't move easily," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, with the quality of a man making an observation rather than a compliment. "I didn't think you would." He stayed for coffee, and they sat on the porch as they had that first evening, and she told him more about William, not because she needed to mourn out loud, but because she found herself comfortable enough with him to talk, which surprised her. She was not a woman who shared herself easily. William had always said she was like this country, requiring patience before she offered anything, but abundant once she did. She told him about the ranch outside Dodge City, about the 2 hard winters and the cattle prices dropping and the bank loans that had grown unmanageable, about William's cough that had started in October and worsened through the winter and become something else entirely by February, about sitting with him in those last weeks while he talked about this valley, this flat piece of land in the Cimarron Basin, as though just having a picture of it in his mind was enough to sustain him. He said it was good land waiting to become something, she said. He said it had patience in it. Harlan listened to all of this without interrupting, which was one of the qualities she was coming to value most about him, this ability to be fully present to what someone was saying without hurrying it along. "What was he like?" Harlan asked. "Your husband." She thought about it honestly. "Hopeful," she said. "Genuinely hopeful, which is rarer than you'd think, and kind. And he worked hard for what he believed in." She paused. "He deserved more time." "Yes," Harlan said simply. She looked at him. "What about you? What do you believe in?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Honest work, fair dealing. Country like this kept the way it is." He looked out at the basin, people being treated with the same worth whatever they came from. She looked at him more carefully. "That last part," she said, "that's not something every man in this territory would say." He looked back at her. "I grew up on the border," he said. "Saw things done to Mexican families that I couldn't square with any sense of right. And I've seen enough of what gets done to people who don't have power when the powerful decide they want something." He paused. "I don't admire it." She understood that there was more in that statement than its surface, and she did not push at it, but she filed it away and found that it made her think differently about him in a way she couldn't entirely articulate yet. He left in the early afternoon, and she watched him go, and was aware for the first time that she was watching him not just because he was leaving, but because she was noticing him, which felt like a more complicated thing than she quite knew what to do with yet. 2 weeks passed, and they settled into a rhythm. The range war continued its uneasy simmer, with incidents along the creek line and occasional shooting in the North Canyon, but nothing that pushed directly onto Cutter's Flat. Ren Stroud had apparently decided to reconsider his approach, at least temporarily, and the flat remained clear of his riders. Josephine's garden surprised her. The late-planted seedlings took hold with an enthusiasm that the dry ground didn't seem to warrant, and she found herself spending time there in the early mornings and late evenings with a pleasure she hadn't expected. She fixed the roof where 2 sections of sod had gone thin and replaced them with fresh-cut turf. She acquired 2 chickens from the Bellamy ranch and built them a small pen beside the cabin. She bought a goat from a Mexican family named Reyes who ran cattle on the eastern edge of the basin, and who stopped at her gate one morning to introduce themselves with the formal courtesy that she found both touching and impressive. The Reyes family, she learned, had been in the basin 20 years longer than either Bellamy or Stroud, their land grant dating to the period before the territory was formalized under United States law, and Stroud had been encroaching on their southern grazing land for 3 years, with the casual confidence of a man who assumed that legal rights meant less when the person holding them didn't look like him. Josephine found this enraging in the quiet, cold way that she found most injustice, and she asked Domingo Reyes, the family patriarch, whether he had documentation of his original grant. He looked at her with something between surprise and caution. "Yes, Senora, we have the papers." "Keep them somewhere fireproof," she said, "and if anyone tries to tell you otherwise, those papers are your ground to stand on." He studied her for a moment. "You are not from here," he said, not unkindly. "No, but I know what it is to have the only thing you own put in question," she said. "I'll stand with you if it comes to it." He nodded slowly, with a gravity that told her he understood the weight of what she was saying. After that, the Reyes family and Josephine Leland had an understanding, and on Sundays she sometimes rode east to share their evening meal, and Domingo's wife Alina made food that Josephine found was exactly the kind of cooking that reached past your stomach and into some other part of you. She told Harlan about this, and he nodded. "Stroud's been moving on their southern acres," he said. "Chester knows it. He's not friendly with the Reyes family exactly, but he won't back Stroud against an old land grant." "He should do more than not back Stroud," she said. He looked at her. "You're probably right." She raised her eyebrows at the directness of that. He almost smiled. "I'm not always right about what Chester should do, but I can still say what I think." "Do you tell him what you think?" "When he'll hear it," he said. The evening she first let herself fully acknowledge what was happening between them, she was at the creek, washing the garden soil from her hands in the current, and Harlan had come by on his evening patrol and stopped at the water's edge without dismounting. The sun was going down in that extraordinary way it did in this country, and the light was falling across the creek and across him in a way that made everything look like something preserved from a dream, and she looked up at him from where she was kneeling at the waterside and thought very clearly, "I am in serious trouble. Not the dangerous kind. The other kind." She stood up and dried her hands on her work skirt and said, "Stay for supper," which was the first time she had said it, and watched the small shift in his expression that told her he understood exactly what she was asking, and what she was asking was more than just supper. "I'd like that," he said. She made salt pork and cornbread, and they ate at the small table she had leveled and repaired and set with the 2 tin plates she owned. And they talked for 2 hours, longer than they had ever sat together. And the conversation moved from range water rights to the territory's application for statehood, from there to the books she had read, and the books he had read, from there to his childhood on the Texas-Mexico border and hers in Virginia, which surprised him. She could see that. She was not what he would have imagined coming from Virginia, and she told him that Virginia was also where she had learned that the things people were told about who deserved what rarely matched the truth. He told her about his father, who had been a surveyor, and about how he had grown up reading the land in the precise way his father had taught him, understanding what it meant and what it could hold. He had come west at 22 with Chester Bellamy's drive, which she calculated put him at 32 now, and she found she was glad the gap between them was only 4 years. At some point, the lantern burned low between them, and neither of them moved to trim it, as though the gradual narrowing of the light was something they were both content to let happen. "Josephine," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without any introduction, just the name itself, and the way he said it made something in her chest turn over. "Harlan," she said, "I've been thinking," he said carefully, turning his coffee cup in his hands, "about what you said the first day, that you had nowhere else to go." "Yes," she said. "I want you to know that's changed," he said. "Whatever happens with the land or the war or any of it. You're not here because there's nowhere else." He looked at her steadily. "You're here because this is where you belong, and I think you know that now." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Yes," she said, "I do." "There's something else I've been thinking," he said, and then stopped, and she had the impression of a careful man navigating toward something important. "Say it," she said gently. He met her eyes. "I find myself looking for reasons to ride this line in the morning," he said, "and not because of the range situation." The lantern was very low between them now, and the firelight from the hearth was doing most of the work of illuminating the room, and she could see his face clearly in it. This man who was careful with everything, with his words and his movements and his judgments, being careful with this too, because he knew it mattered. "I've noticed," she said, "that I don't mind when it's you." Something released in his expression, the particular kind of tension that a person carries when they're waiting to hear something important. They sat with it a while longer, this new thing they had named without quite naming, and then he rose to go because it was late and because he was the kind of man who would not overstay, and she walked him to the door, and at the threshold he turned and looked at her in the firelight and said simply, "Good night, Josephine." "Yes." "Good night, Harlan," she said, and closed the door, and stood with her back against it for a moment and let herself feel what she was feeling, which was large and complicated and not entirely comfortable, and also, underneath all of that, something that she recognized as joy, quiet and cautious as a new fire catching. The range war came to a head in early August, which was perhaps inevitable. Ren Stroud had been building toward something through July, and the signs had been there for those who were reading them. He brought in 6 additional riders from somewhere south of the basin, rough men who did not have the look of cattlemen, and he pushed his herd across the creek in the night with a body of armed men riding alongside. And by dawn, he had occupied the creek line, and the Bellamy riders who came to the water found themselves looking at a wall of armed men where the open grass had been the evening before. Chester Bellamy called all his hands in that morning, and Harlan rode to Cutter's Flat first and told Josephine what was happening. She listened, standing in the doorway of her cabin with the morning light behind her, and then she said, "This is going to end with someone dead if it stays between the two of them." "Chester's not going to back down," Harlan said, "and Stroud knows that. Someone needs to break the frame of it," she said. "Change the terms." "What do you mean?" She thought for a moment. "What does Stroud actually need? If you strip away the pride and the posturing, what is the actual problem?" He looked at her. "Water," he said. "His southern range is drying out. He needs access to the creek. And Bellamy won't give it. Not without conditions Stroud won't accept." She was quiet a moment. "The north end of my parcel runs to within a quarter-mile of Stroud's western fence," she said slowly, "and my creek runs year-round." He understood what she was working toward, and his eyes sharpened. "You'd offer Stroud water access." "On terms," she said. "Set price per head per season. Written agreement witnessed. No encroachment on the land itself, no fences, no riders staying on the flat." She looked at him. "If he has his water, he doesn't need to fight for the creek." "He might not take it," Harlan said. "He might. He's a practical man underneath the stubbornness. Practical men will often take a solution that saves face if it's presented right." She straightened. "But someone needs to present it." He looked at her steadily. "You want to go to Stroud?" "I want to go to Stroud," she said. He said nothing for a moment, and she could see him working through it, the risk on one side and the logic on the other. "I'll go with you," he said. "You're a Bellamy man," she said. "That complicates it." "I'm going with you," he repeated, with a quiet firmness that she decided not to argue with. They rode to Stroud's western camp, where he had positioned his additional riders along the creek. There were armed men everywhere, and the atmosphere had the coiled, anticipatory quality of the minutes before a thunderstorm. Harlan rode beside her, and she was glad of his presence, not because she needed someone to speak for her, but because she noticed that the armed men they passed looked at them together and held their fire in a way that spoke of uncertainty, and uncertainty was the gap she needed. Ren Stroud was at his camp near a stand of willows, and he looked at her arrival with an expression that was hard to read. Surprise, possibly. Something that was not quite respect but reaching toward it. "Mrs. Leland," he said. "Mr. Stroud," she said, "I want to offer you something." She laid it out as she had described it to Harlan, simply and plainly. Water access on the north end of Cutter's Flat, licensed and paid and documented, enough for his southern herd through the dry months, no riders on the land, no encroachment, clean terms that a lawyer could put to paper. Stroud listened without interrupting, which she took as a positive sign. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He looked at Harlan. "You're a Bellamy man," he said. "I'm here with Josephine," Harlan said. "This is her offer." Stroud looked back at her. "What does Bellamy want out of it?" "This is my land and my offer," she said. "Chester Bellamy has nothing to do with it. But if you take the water access and pull your men back from the creek line, I expect the pressure between your operation and his would ease considerably." He turned his hat in his hands, much the way Harlan turned his, she noticed, and she wondered if that was something men in this country did when they were thinking seriously. "Half the fee you named," he said. "3/4, she said. He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "You negotiate like someone who's been doing it a long time." "I've been alive 28 years in a world that assumed I wasn't capable of it," she said. "That's good practice." He made the sound that was almost a laugh, and this time he let it be a laugh. "3/4, he said. "Written agreement, as you said, your lawyer or mine. Territorial Land Office, witnessed by the county recorder," she said. "So it's nobody's lawyer." He extended his hand and she shook it, and behind her she heard Harlan exhale very quietly. The agreement was put to paper at the county seat 3 days later, and the shooting stopped. It did not stop all at once. There was one more incident along the creek line that week. 2 of Stroud's rough hired riders who hadn't gotten the news or hadn't cared, which resulted in a broken fence and a Bellamy cowhand with a grazed shoulder. And Stroud dealt with his riders directly, and with the kind of efficiency that suggested he did not want any further complications to his arrangement. After that, the basin settled into something that was not exactly peace but was working toward it. Chester Bellamy came to Cutter's Flat on a Saturday morning to sit on the porch and have coffee and say, in his limited way, that he thought she had done something worth doing. "Didn't expect it," he said. "Any of it. From the morning you rode down that ridge to this." "I didn't have an agenda," she said. "I just needed the problem solved so I could get on with things." He looked at her. "What is it you're planning to build here?" "A working ranch," she said. "Small to start, cattle eventually. The kitchen garden is already in." She looked out at the flat, which in the August heat was bleached gold and very beautiful. "This is good country. It deserves someone working it properly." He nodded. He looked toward the south, in the direction of his ranch house. "Harlan thinks so too," he said, which was not exactly subtle, but she let it pass without comment and refilled his coffee. That evening Harlan came by without any stated reason and sat on the porch with her as the light went gold and then amber and then the rose-purple of dusk over the canyon walls, and they sat in the comfortable silence that had become one of her favorite things, the silence that was not absence but presence, the silence of 2 people who had found that simply being in the same space was something. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That this place is working on me," she said. "More than I expected." "How so?" She considered. "When I came, it was the plan that held me together, the deed and the cabin and the idea of building something, and that's still real. But something else is happening too." She looked at the canyon walls going purple in the fading light. "I'm putting down roots," she said. "I can feel it, like the garden." He was quiet a moment. "That's a good thing," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It frightens me a little." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because the last time I had roots, I lost them." He turned to look at her, and in the evening light his face was open in a way it wasn't always, the careful watchfulness set aside for the moment. "You didn't lose them," he said quietly. "You carried them here." She felt that land somewhere deep. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Harlan." "Yes." "I'd like you to kiss me," she said, because she was Josephine Leland and she had found that the direct approach, applied to the right moment, generally got you where you needed to be. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, careful eyes, and then he leaned across the small space between their chairs and kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that starts slow and then finds its depth. The way a river starts shallow at its bank and then drops away below you into something cool and permanent. When they separated, the dusk had deepened around them and the first stars were showing over the eastern ridge, and she thought she had never been more aware of where she was and who she was in her life. "I've been wanting to do that," he said, "since about the fourth day." "The fourth day," she repeated. "The morning you were fixing the corral fence and you told Duff that if he wanted to help he could hold the post straight instead of giving opinions," he said. "And he held the post." She laughed. It came out freely and without self-consciousness, which was something she had not been sure she still knew how to do, and he looked at her laughing with an expression that made something in her chest feel large. September came to the Cimarron Basin, with the first cooler air coming down from the north at nights, and a change in the quality of the light, sharper and more golden, and the basin's grass going from gold to wheat brown. Josephine's garden had given her more than she'd hoped, and she spent several days putting up preserved vegetables in the root cellar and drying herbs on the windowsills. The cabin had become a home in a way she had not quite planned for but accepted. She and Harlan had settled into a courtship that was conducted in the open, unhurried way of two people who had both arrived at this point from difficult roads and were not going to rush whatever was happening by trying to race ahead of it. He came for supper twice a week. She rode south to the Bellamy Ranch with him on Sunday mornings to attend the informal service that Rose held in the kitchen, which was attended by whichever hands wanted to come, and which was more practical and less formal than any church service Josephine had attended in Virginia. She liked it. He brought her books when he could get them, from the county seat or from passing peddlers, knowing that she read voraciously and that the evenings were long. She lent him her copy of Middlemarch, which she had been rereading, and he read it slowly and came back with observations about it that surprised her and then didn't surprise her, because she was coming to understand that Harlan Vaughn had the kind of interior life that men who looked like him were generally not assumed to have. They had the conversation about the future on a Tuesday evening in late September, sitting on the porch with their coffee cups and the enormous sky above them going from blue to black with the stars arriving one by one. He said without preamble, "I've been thinking about what comes next." "Tell me," she said. "Chester's offered me a stake in the Bellamy operation, a junior partnership. It's a fair offer." He paused. "But it would mean staying where I am, foreman of someone else's ranch." "Is that what you want?" He was quiet. "What I want," he said carefully, "has changed recently." She looked at him. "I want to put something in the ground," he said, "something that's mine. That we," and here he paused, weighing the word build. She kept looking at him. "We," she said. "If that's something you'd consider," he said, and the carefulness in his voice was more than usual because this was more than usual. "Harlan," she said, "I'm going to need you to be plain with me." He turned to face her fully, setting his cup down on the porch rail. In the starlight his face was very clear to her, this face she had been learning for 3 months, every expression of it, and what she saw in it now was something unguarded and very serious. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you'll have me, I want to build something here on this land together. I'm not going to pretend I've never met a woman like you before because that would be a lie. I haven't. And I'm not a man who wastes what comes to him when it's good." He paused. "That's what I'm saying." The stars were very bright overhead, and the air smelled of the first real coolness of autumn and the distant smoke from the Bellamy cook fair. And she looked at this man who had ridden beside her into an armed camp to help her solve a problem that wasn't his, who listened when she spoke, who read Middlemarch and had opinions about it, who was careful and honest and whose hands were gentle when they were not needed to be strong. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again, and was smiling, which she could feel in all her face. He reached out and took her hand between his two hands, which were exactly as she'd expected them to be, steady and warm. They sat like that for a long time looking at the enormous Oklahoma sky and the basin below them in the dark, and she thought that William had been right, that this was good land waiting to become something, and she thought that what it was waiting to become was perhaps more than he had imagined. They were married in October. Rose organized the celebration with the decisive competence of a woman who runs a large household and treats every project the same way, efficiently and well. The service was performed by a traveling Methodist preacher named Rowlands, who came through the basin monthly, and who had, over the previous months, become accustomed to stopping at Cutter's Flat for Josephine's coffee and her cornbread, which he said was the best in the territory. Chester Bellamy attended and stood through the service with his hat over his heart, and the look of a man who finds himself surprised by his own emotion and is not sure what to do with it. The Ray's family came, all of them, Domingo and Alina and their 4 children, and Alina brought food that made the reception a genuine occasion. Duff and the other Bellamy hands came scrubbed and earnest in their best clothes. Ren Stroud sent a bottle of whiskey and a note that said he wished them well, which was as much as anyone had expected from him, and perhaps slightly more. Josephine wore a dress that Alina Reyes had helped her make from blue wool cloth, the color of the basin sky in autumn. She had not worn her mourning dress since the day she arrived, which felt like both a betrayal and a permission, and she had sat with that feeling and found that William, who had been hopeful above all things, would have chosen the blue wool without hesitation. When Preacher Rowland said the words and Harlan put the ring on her finger, a simple ring of silver that he had made at the county seat, she looked at him and thought about all the ways a life could end and all the ways it could begin again, and found that she was not afraid of either. They walked out into the October afternoon, husband and wife, and the basin was brilliant with autumn color, the grass deep gold and the cottonwood leaves gone yellow along the creek, and it was the most beautiful thing she thought she had ever walked out into. The first winter on Cutter's Flat was hard but not cruel. The cold came in November and the snow followed in December, and they worked side by side through it with the rhythm that had been building since September, each of them knowing what the other needed before it had to be said, which was the kind of knowledge that takes time to develop and cannot be hurried. Harlan had formally declined Chester Bellamy's partnership offer, which Chester had accepted with a grumbling affection that was as close to approval as he was likely to give anyone. Harlan still consulted for the Bellamy Ranch a few days each week, which provided steady income while they built the Cutter's Flat operation from the ground up. They bought 8 head of cattle in November from a drover passing through. They expanded the corral. Harlan built a second room onto the cabin before the deep cold came, working fast and well, and they chinked the walls against the winter wind and stacked firewood to the roofline of the storage lean-to. On the evenings when the cold kept them inside, they read by the fire and talked in the unhurried way that people talk when they have all the time of their shared lives ahead of them. He told her more about his father and she told him more about Virginia, and they built between them the continuous story of each other that couples build, the story that becomes the foundation of everything that follows. She told him once, deep in December when the snow was deep and the fire was high and they were lying awake in the dark talking as they often did, that she still thought about William. "I know," he said. "Is that difficult?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He loved you and you loved him, and that's part of who you are. I wouldn't want any part of you removed." He paused. "I'd have liked to have known him." She held that for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said. "He admired honest men." "That's a good thing to admire," he said. She turned toward him in the dark. "You are a very good man, Harlan Vaughn." She could feel him smile even in the dark. "You're a very good woman, Josephine Vaughn," he said, and it was the first time he had used her new name, and she felt it settle over her like something that had always been true and had only just been said. Spring came to the Cimarron Basin with the conviction that spring always brought to this country, arriving fast and green and loud with birds, and Cutter's flat emerged from the winter looking like a different place, or perhaps the same place with different eyes on it. Josephine's garden was already planned on paper, and she put it in the ground in April with a scope that was 3 times what she'd attempted the previous year. She planted a proper kitchen garden and a section of feed grain, and a row of fruit trees along the south fence that would take years to produce, but which she intended to see productive. In April she also knew, with the certainty that women know such things, that she was carrying a child. She told Harlan on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the table after supper, because she was Josephine and she did not dress things up or deliver news obliquely. She said, "I'm going to have a baby." He looked at her across the table, and his expression went through 3 or 4 things in rapid succession: surprise, and then comprehension, and then something that was too large to name, and then he was out of his chair and had his arms around her in a way that was completely unlike his usual careful deliberateness, and she felt in that embrace exactly how much this mattered to him and allowed herself, for a moment, to let it matter just as much to her. "When?" he said, his voice rough. "November, I think," she said. "Rose will know better." He pulled back and looked at her with bright eyes. "A baby," he said, as though testing the word. "A baby," she confirmed. He sat down heavily in his chair and then immediately stood up again, not knowing apparently what to do with himself, which was the most undone she had ever seen him, and she found it enormously endearing. "Sit down," she said, laughing. He sat. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" "Tired in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise well." He nodded, taking this in with great seriousness. "I'll take the morning chores." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," he said, exactly as he had said it the first time he helped her on the flat, and they both remembered that at the same moment, and she saw his mouth curve. Rose was consulted and confirmed the November estimate, and provided practical advice with brisk authority and the look of a woman who was very pleased, though she only said that the important thing was for Josephine to eat well and rest more than she thought she needed to. The summer of 1883 was the best summer Cutter's flat had seen, which was not saying much since it was only the flat's second working summer, but Josephine felt it as something real and true. The range war between Bellamy and Stroud had settled into a cold but functional peace, maintained by the water agreement and by the shared exhaustion of men who had been tense for too long. Stroud's hired Rough Riders had drifted back south. The basin was quiet. The creek ran full and clear along the eastern edge of the flat. Domingo Reyes won his case at the territorial court regarding his southern grazing land, which Josephine had helped him document and present, writing 3 letters on his behalf to the land office, and appearing personally at the county seat to speak as a neighboring landowner to the legitimacy of his grant. The judge had been surprised to see a woman standing at the rail speaking to land records, but she had laid the facts out clearly and without apology, and the decision had gone in favor of the Reyes family, and Domingo had come to the flat the following morning and stood at her fence with his hat in his hand and said simply that his family would not forget it. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You had the right. It just needed saying properly." He looked at her. "It needed someone willing to say it," he said. "That is not nothing, Senora." Harlan had been with her at the county seat that day and had said nothing during the proceeding itself, understanding that this was hers to do, but on the ride home he had reached across and taken her hand without saying anything, and she had felt in that gesture everything he might have said and found it was enough. On the 18th of November, 1883, their son was born. Rose was there, and Alina Reyes was there, and Harlan was in the next room pacing with the focused anxiety of a man who can do nothing useful and knows it. The labor was long and hard, and at its most difficult Josephine was purely present to it without any thought of anything else. And then it was done, and there was a sound that she had never heard before, the first cry of this specific new person entering the world, and everything else simply fell away. Rose brought her the baby wrapped in the blue wool cloth that had been her wedding dress fabric, and he was red and furious and perfect. And she held him, and was overwhelmed in a way that she had not been overwhelmed since William had died. And this was the other side of that coin. This was what overwhelmed you when life came toward you instead of away. Harlan came in and stood at the doorway, and she said, "Come here." And he came to the bed and looked down at them both with an expression she knew she would carry the rest of her life. "A boy," she said. He reached out one careful hand and touched the baby's head with his fingertips. He started and stopped, and she understood that he did not have words for what he was, which was fine because neither did she. They named him Thomas William Vaughn. Thomas for Harlan's father, and William for the man whose dream had brought them all to this flat piece of land in the Cimarron Basin. Thomas William Vaughn grew. He was a sturdy, curious child from the beginning, with Harlan's dark eyes and Josephine's determined chin, and he spent his early months being carried in a sling against his mother's body while she moved through the daily work of the flat, because she refused to stop working and also refused to set him down, and found that these two requirements were not incompatible. By his first birthday, the Cutter's flat cattle operation had grown to 32 head. They had hired a single hand, a young man named Calhoun who was 17, and had come to the basin with a cattle drive and been left behind when he'd broken his ankle, and who turned out to be one of the most capable workers Josephine had encountered. Once it became clear that on Cutter's flat he was expected to do what he was told regardless of who was telling him. Calhoun had looked at her once early with the expression of a young man adjusting his expectations, and she had looked back at him calmly and said, "I run this ranch, Mr. Calhoun, my husband and I together. If that's a problem for you, best to know now." He had thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and said, "No, ma'am, that'll be fine," and had meant it, and they had gotten on very well after that. Chester Bellamy died in the spring of 1885 of a heart that had been working hard for 62 years and simply decided it had done enough. He died in his own bed with Rose at one side and Harlan at the other, and was buried on the ridge above his ranch house with a view of the basin that would have satisfied him. Harlan was named in the will as the recipient of a modest legacy that Chester had been quietly accumulating for years, which was enough to double the Cutter's flat herd and put a proper timber and stone addition on the cabin. Josephine stood at Chester's grave on the day of the burial and thought about the morning she had sat at his kitchen table with her deed and her $43 and told him she had nowhere else to go, and felt the weight of everything that had happened since then, which was enormous, and also the gratitude, which was just as large. "He was a fair man," she said to Harlan on the ride home. "Fairer than most," Harlan said, "and he knew it when something was worth keeping." She looked at him. "He told me once," Harlan said, "about a week after you arrived, that the woman from the ridge was going to change the basin. He didn't know how exactly, but he said he could feel it." She was quiet for a moment. "Did he mean it as a warning?" "No," Harlan said with the almost smile. "He meant it as an observation." She looked at him riding beside her in the spring afternoon, Thomas William sitting in front of him on the saddle in the manner of a boy who had been on horseback since he was old enough to be held there, and felt the whole of what had become her life arranged before her like the basin itself, large and particular and full of more than she had originally imagined. The summer of 1885 brought news of a railroad spur being considered through the basin, which would change everything about how cattle were moved to market, and Josephine attended the county meeting, where it was discussed with the same directness she brought to everything, asking specific questions about the route and the land acquisition process and the water rights implications. Because she had learned by now that being present and specific at the moment when things were decided was the only way to have any influence over the deciding. She also brought Domingo Reyes to that meeting and sat beside him while he asked his own questions about what the survey route would mean for his land grant. And when the county surveyor answered him with the particular kind of polite dismissiveness that Josephine recognized as a prelude to being ignored, she leaned forward and said very clearly, "Mr. Reyes has a legally confirmed federal land grant, properly recorded. whose terms supersede local land acquisition authority. I would suggest the survey account for that before any route is finalized. There was a long silence, and then the surveyor made a note and said he would check the records. Harlan, sitting beside her, said nothing, but his hand found hers under the table and pressed once, briefly, which was his way. The railroad came through the basin in 1887, and the survey route had, in fact, accounted for the Ray's land grant. It had also accounted for Cutter's Flat, curving south to avoid both, and when the steel arrived in the basin, it arrived without taking what did not belong to it, which Josephine considered a reasonable outcome for considerable effort. The cattle market changed everything, as it always does when the rails arrive. Cutter's Flat, by 1887, was running 112 head on the original 40 acres, plus an additional 60 acres Harlan had purchased from a family moving north. They had hired 2 more hands. The original cabin had been transformed by its additions into a proper ranch house with a proper kitchen and 3 rooms and a front porch that looked west across the basin to the canyon walls. Thomas William was 4 years old and believed firmly that he was in charge of the chickens, the goat, and his own opinion on every matter, which kept his parents busy. He was also, both of them privately admitted, the kind of child who makes everything worth having been through, because when you watched him in the mornings running across the flat in the early light, certain of the ground under his feet and the sky above him, you understood what this land was for. It was on a morning in May of 1887, while Josephine was in the garden and Thomas William was conducting his chicken supervision nearby, that she became aware again of the certainty she had first felt 4 years ago, and this time it came with less surprise and more gladness. She told Harlan that evening at supper. He looked at her across the table, older than the man she had married and more known to her, which was both what 4 years did and what loving someone did, and his face went through the same rapid sequence as before but faster this time because the territory was familiar. "How do you feel?" he said. "Very well," she said, "though I suspect I'll be tired in the mornings again." "I'll take the morning chores," he said. "You always take the morning chores now," she pointed out. "Then that part will be easy," he said, and smiled, fully and without the usual reservation, because there was no one to be reserved for, just the kitchen and the lamplight and the boy asleep in his room and this new thing that had announced itself. Their daughter was born in December of 1887, on a night when the snow was deep on the flat and the fire was high, and Rose, who was somewhat older now and moved more slowly but was no less decisive, was again present, and Josephine was again purely present to the extraordinary business of bringing someone new into the world. She was smaller than Thomas William had been and quieter from the very beginning, coming into the world with a kind of considering calm that her mother recognized immediately. Harlan came in and looked at her and said nothing for a long moment, which was how he received large things. Then he said, "She looks like you." "She looks like herself," Josephine said. They named her Clara Rose Vaughn. Clara because Josephine had always liked the name, and Rose for Rose, who burst into a rare, complete smile when she heard it and excused herself briefly to the kitchen. The years that followed were full ones, in the way that years are full when you have built something real. The flat prospered. Thomas William grew into the kind of boy who wanted to know everything about the land he was on, its water and its grass and its weather, and Harlan taught him with the same patience and thoroughness that his own father had taught him, the precise reading of landscape that tells you what it can hold and what it needs. Clara grew into a girl with her father's watchful eyes and her mother's direct tongue, and at 3 years old was already announcing things with a clarity that made everyone around her want to laugh. Josephine continued to be Josephine. She attended county meetings and territorial conventions and wrote letters to the land office on behalf of herself and her neighbors with the same brisk, informed precision she had always applied to things that needed to be applied to. When the territorial statehood process began to accelerate in the early 1890s, She was among the voices in the Cimarron Basin arguing for land protections in the new state framework, and two of the provisions she advocated for appeared in the final documentation, which she found out from the territorial surveyor who sent a note complimenting her persistence. Harlan read the note and said, "Persistence. I prefer thoroughness," she said. "So does the outcome," he said. Ren Stroud died in 1889, not by violence but by a fever that took him faster than anyone expected, which was the kind of end that feels wrong for a man who seemed built to outlast everything. His ranch was divided among his 3 sons, who were more interested in selling than ranching, and within 2 years the Stroud land had been bought up by a cattle company out of Kansas City, which was a different kind of threat and a different kind of story, one that the Basin began dealing with collectively rather than individually. The Bellamy Ranch, now run by Chester's nephew Robert, the Ray's family, and Cutter's Flat became a quiet but consistent alliance in the face of the company's early efforts to consolidate water rights, and the effort failed, and the company eventually redirected its attention north, which was a satisfactory outcome. On an October evening in 1890, 8 years to the month from the morning Josephine Leland had ridden down the ridge above the Cimarron Basin, she and Harlan sat on the porch of the ranch house that Cutter's Flat had become, with the basin spread below them in the late light, and the sound of Thomas William and Clara somewhere inside beginning an argument about something, and then resolving it, which was the sound of their daily life. The October sky was doing what the October sky in this country did, which was turn colors that had no adequate names, deep rose and amber, and a kind of luminous gray above the canyon walls, and the flat below was the warm brown of late autumn grass. "I've been thinking," Harlan said. "Tell me," she said. "8 years ago I stood behind a stone wall and watched a woman ride straight down the middle of a shooting ground," he said. "And Duff asked me who she was and I had absolutely no idea." She looked at him. "Now I know," he said. "She waited. She is the most remarkable person I have ever had the privilege of knowing," he said, looking at her with those dark, careful eyes that were so familiar to her now, every variation of them, the watchful and the warm and the quietly amused, and the one she was seeing now which was all of those together. "And I am grateful every day for the fact that she had nowhere else to go." She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had become the ground she stood on without diminishing any of her own ground, which was the thing she had not thought would be possible and which had turned out to be exactly possible when the person was exactly right. "Harlan," she said, "yes, I'm going to tell you something. All right. The morning I rode down that ridge," she said, "I was terrified, not of the guns exactly, of what came after if the land was gone or ruined or taken. Of running out of road completely." She paused, "and then you stood up from behind that wall and looked at me and I had the strangest feeling." "What feeling?" "That the road was still there," she said. "That there was more of it than I'd thought." He reached over and took her hand, which he had been doing for 8 years and which still felt, each time, like a deliberate choice rather than a habit. "There is," he said. "There is considerably more." They sat like that as the October sky moved through its extraordinary colors above the Cimarron Basin, and the children's voices came warm through the walls of the house they had built, and the flat below them lay quiet and abundant in the evening light, the garden put to bed for winter and the cattle ranged along the creek, and the fence lined straight and true from one end to the other. Everything they had built was there, visible and real, made of work and honesty and the particular kind of love that does not announce itself but accumulates, steadily and permanently, the way a creek carves a channel, not by force but by persistence, by the simple faithful act of being present every day and letting that presence be enough. Thomas William appeared in the doorway behind them. He was 6 years old and very serious. "Mama," he said. "Clara says the goat has opinions and I told her goats don't have opinions and she won't stop." Josephine looked at her son, then at her husband, who was visibly containing the almost smile. "Clara is right," Josephine said. "Goats do have opinions." Come sit with us, and I'll tell you about it." Thomas William considered this, and then came out and settled on the porch step with the air of a boy who is reserving judgment. And a moment later Clara appeared and settled herself beside him with the satisfied expression of a girl who has been vindicated. The four of them sat on the porch in the October evening, the two adults and the two children, in the gold and amber light of the Cimarron Basin. And the basin held them the way good country holds the people who have learned to be worthy of it, steadily and without fanfare, simply and permanently. The way land holds everything that has ever lived and worked on it, in the deep patient memory of the ground itself. The road, as Harlan had said, was considerably more than she had thought. And every morning she woke in this house, in this life, beside this man, she understood that the most important thing she had ever done was ride straight down that ridge with nowhere left to go and everything still ahead of her, and let the road show her where it went. She had not expected this. She would not have traded it for anything in the world. And when spring came again to the Cimarron Basin, as it always did and always would, arriving green and certain, and full of the specific conviction that this year would hold what the last year had built, Josephine Leland Vaughn was in her garden with her hands in the good dark soil, and the flat stretched away around her in the new light, and she put in the seeds and knew they would grow, the way she had learned to know things in this country, not by certainty but by faith. The particular hard-won faith of a woman who had ridden into the unknown alone and found, on the other side of it, everything worth finding. Cutter's Flat bloomed every spring, and so did she.